Hello and welcome to Writers and Books. My name is Dan Hurd. I'm the Director of Adult Programs. Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, and literary programming for people of all ages and backgrounds. You can find more information at our website, wab.org. We're so happy to collaborate with BOA Editions to bring you readings and conversations with their fall slate of authors. Books are available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books. I'll put the link in the chat. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are hosting this event from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the Keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have Cynthia Dewi Oka with us tonight. She will be in conversation with author and poet Peter Connors, who is the publisher and executive director of BOA Editions. In her fourth poetry collection, Cynthia Dewi Oka performs a lyric accounting of the anti-communist genocide of 1965, which, led by the Indonesian military and with American assistance, erased and devastated millions of lives in Indonesia. Selected by Aracelis Girmay, a Tinderbox in 3 acts is at once elegy and exegesis, fact and invention. Where memory fails, here is poetry to honor the dishonored, the betrayed, the lost, and still awaited. Cynthia Dewi Oka is the author of Fire is Not a Country, Salvage, and Nomad of Salt and Hard Water. A recipient of the Amy Clampett Residency, Tupelo Quarterly Poetry Prize, and the Leeway Transformation Award, her writing appears in The Atlantic, Poetry, Academy of American Poets, Poetry Society of America, Guernica, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. She has taught creative writing at Bryn Mawr College, New Mexico State University, and Voices of Our Nations. She's originally from Bali, Indonesia. Please welcome Cynthia Dewi Oka. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, folks. And I'm sorry, Dan, I should have probably clarified with you earlier. My name is Cynthia Dewi Oka, just like for future pronunciation. I'm going to start with this poem, the first one in a Tinderbox in 3 acts. It's the book. Apologia. On earth, I have mistaken a rock for a voice for a listening. With my shovel by the sea, with the long shadows of fishermen hauling living diamonds out of the water, the air itself green. A man beat me while a woman watched, crossing her wrists. Then I learned to think in your language. Went door knocking, wasting good cloth on banners that kept nobody warm. I made shells out of unstable electricity, flew a long way to catalog the wedding dresses jets leave in the sky. In a theater without hands, I would have liked to fall asleep being held, but held vigil instead for the kites that tugged free of their children. Under the night sand, I gave names to unsinging bones, found in my body as though I were made of a historical material. I tried to contain them. Like a capitalist, donning felt hats on the decapitated and American gum to stick to a wall, the letters announcing democracy, like a cool band. My parents were essentially reasonable people, keeping themselves curtained, and a piece of paper post as a door. An aunt visiting the Pacific Northwest for the first time after a 20-hour flight said to no one in particular, "Your streets are so clean. There are no ghosts here." I too have difficulty separating one love from another. Is it true Suharto was a hero? My mother asked. In English, I have found survival both a literary fetish and socially awkward. The truth is, I called myself comrade because it was convenient to adapt rules for revolutionary behavior from Ecclesiastes. Like anywhere on earth, the flip side of a hill is a hole. My shovel makes the rocks leap. Open, it says, with its stern and painted edge. So I wanted to offer a little bit of historical context, which is clarified early in the book for new readers and who are not familiar with what happened in Indonesia in 1965. It makes sense because these events have been suppressed for a very long time, and the Indonesian government engaged for many years, particularly the New Order regime that came into power in the aftermath of the genocide, engaged in a really vigorous disinformation campaign about what actually happened. So to kind of give you the broad contours of that particular period, in 1965, Indonesia was a young country, was less than 20 years old, and its Communist Party was actually the third largest in the world. So just behind the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. The United States was obviously very concerned about this and was at the same time engaged in a war to eliminate, to defeat the communists in Vietnam. And so there are documents, essentially historical archives that evidence, the concerns of the Lyndon Johnson administration at the time. It was high priority for them. They wanted to figure out how they can intervene in Indonesian politics to prevent the communists from coming into power, because our first president, President Sukarno, was aligned with the Communist Party. So he wasn't a member of the Communist Party, but they were in political alignment with each other. And in the early 60s, the Communist Party was very organized, and they had also people inside of the military. And there were rumors or information that they obtained that, the US was planning to back a coup to take out Sukarno because of his alignment with the communists. And so a small group of leaders, and they were actually from the Indonesian military themselves, they went and preempted that coup by taking out 6 generals. By taking out, they kidnapped and murdered 6 generals from the Indonesian military. They were actually targeting 7, but the 7th escaped, and a lieutenant was taken in his place. He was also killed. And their bodies were dumped inside of a pit in a suburb outside of Jakarta called Lubang Buaya, which means crocodile's pit. In retaliation for the loss of those generals, the Indonesian military went on a campaign to purge all leftist elements from Indonesia, with American support, but also with British support, with Australian support. And the mass party, all of these people who have been organizing, artists, scholars, folks from the village, landless peasants, all of the people that were involved in organizing for more equity in the country post-independence, under sort of like the auspices or in alliance with the Communist Party. None of them knew about what had happened. Like, they were not part of this like master plan to like take out the 6 generals, but they were the ones that became targeted. And what was also particularly horrific was the military, because it didn't just do the thing itself. They empowered and or terrorized civilian groups to go and slaughter their own neighbors, their own family members, like anyone who was suspected or accused of being a communist. And of course, you can imagine that, like if people were like having regular conflicts with each other and somebody wanted to get rid of somebody, like at that time, it would be, you can just say that person was a communist and get rid of them. So this is sort of like the broad picture of what happened. And because the purge was so successful, and Suharto, who was a general, who was the one of the remaining generals, one of the ones who wasn't taken out because he actually at the time was not, considered that important. He ended up rising through the ranks as like the leader of the campaign to eliminate leftists from Indonesia. And he ended up becoming our second president in Indonesia, and ruled with an iron fist and extreme corruption for the next 32 years under what is, known as the New Order regime. And it is essentially a really authoritarian fascist regime. So then that's like the context that I wanted to share. And this book is built out of, I have been doing research for many years into these events. And then in 2017, a trove of archives that had previously been classified were finally declassified. And I used them as my primary material in conjunction with like other historical archives that were available in order to kind of build the substance of the book. The thing that you need to know is that there are 6 fictional speakers in this book. So I will read from some of them. And they represent sort of like different perspectives / positions within the sort of turmoil that was like happening at the time. There's a 7th fictional speaker called Noni, and she is sort of my alter ego. She's like the poet and also kind of the interlocutor, if that makes sense, with the ghosts. There are these interrogation poems where she actually like interviews the various ghosts, but then the dynamics also get blurry in those moments because they are also questioning her, like what is her business writing about this? Rules of the interrogation. 1, you do not choose to enter the interrogation room. 2, there is no direct correlation between what you reveal and what is recorded. 3, there is no direct correlation between what you speak and what you reveal. 4, the interrogation room is not equipped with smoke alarms. 5, water is provided. 6, and an army in the water. 7, seek and forgiveness will not find you. 8, your body will not close again. 9, your body is evidence in a long chain of custody that began with masts like doves grazing on the sea. 10, you are the interrogation room. Here, raise your children. Here, immortality. So I will actually read one of these interrogation poems. And because there are two speakers and there's just one me, I believe in you guys. I believe you can tell them apart. So I will pause between sort of like as they're taking turns speaking. The subject being interviewed in this one is Satria, which is like one of the ghosts, and this is his portrait. And Satria was a nationalist political prisoner under the Sukarno regime. So he had an interest in having Sukarno taken out and getting rid of the communists. Window 83. Our first speaker here is Satria. What you're trying to do is incite a process of revision. This is Nani. Does that bother you? Not necessarily. What is a nation, after all, if not a series of revision? Deletions, too. You wanted to see lists of names crossed off. I was in prison for a long time. What did you expect? After we lost a common enemy, we lost each other. You mean the National Revolution? It was a simple idea, to feed ourselves, to exist for ourselves. Then power came into the mix. Power is secondary to desire. Marx, in his arrogance, imagined God an opiate, rather than a necessary regulating principle in a field of unrelenting desires. Poverty killed 4 of his children, so he could do as he pleased. He was afflicted by boils that made him cruel to his truest friends because he refused to change his diet. What would Marx know about wanting the inconceivable than having to settle for power? What are you typing? I am composing a letter to the President of the United States. Twitter would be more efficient and effective, probably. The president is not a person, but a dimension where desire and power meet. For the president, I will be a bird. After the purge, you were released from prison. The military recognized my diplomatic and literary skills, which had neither diplomatic nor literary results. Cute. For 3.5 centuries, the Dutch forced us to murder and enslave each other. Without God, all we have is the blood between us. But isn't the history of God a history of blood then? Now you are sounding like a communist. But most of the people eliminated were practicing believers. Are you not even a little ashamed? Shame is an import item with a very high tariff. Then what is the nation you desire? With great eruptions, we have shaped the fate of the atmosphere. A bird does not fly against the wind. So this next poem that I'm going to read is structured like a telegram. It looks like this. That's like my little post-it to let me know the page number. So the archives that I was working with, the majority of the documents in it are these missives, are like these telegrams essentially being sent by American state officials that were working in the embassy in Jakarta to report on what was happening on the ground to Washington. So they were like coordinating essentially like different tactics about like who to talk to, but also like mapping out like what was, how the mass killings, the genocide was moving on a day-to-day basis. So for these telegrams, like all of the language that I use in the telegram poems are directly from the archives. I sort of just like, you know, I picked and chose and rearranged them as needed. By access to sea, bodies unequivocal, go down burning. To indoctrinate surrounded workers, float pictures of mutilated 6 generals patrol provinces with captions. Hardcore Protestant on communists, violence in Buginese region, bone detention. Muslims broke into camp 200 communists to clean at behest of General Suharto. Dry season, successfully executing 15,000 prisoners or killing before capture. According to Mouthpiece, blood a victim rubbed on face is a assured path to heaven. This next poem is by the ghost Dewi, that's the middle name. That is her portrait. And she's really important to me because she was, I think like that's one of the targets of the purge that, like they were very passionate. The military was like really, really passionate about eliminating this particular group, was Kerawani, and that is Gerakan Wanita Indonesia, which is the Indonesian women's movement. They are feminists. And they were accused of, mutilating the generals, and there's a long legacy of continued sort of like violence, like it's structured. So like the way that women were regulated under the new order, I definitely experienced that directly. My mother's generation did as well. A really kind of violent form of heteropatriarchy. This is her poem, or one of them. Fauna is Flora, Bandung, February 1966. A man I hold cries without bottom. Thousands not born giant, decisive or dead already. The soldiers cut into the shallow sacks of muscles gone slack. Their shoulders shredded by feathers. I admire the helicopter, said the sky, while trucks of men in uniform dragged a flamingo across the mountains. Ibu lifting the coal over his eyes, making a dirt house. What is for, if not conviction, ambition, ideology, onions? A dog drank their blinding sound. Our admirable lips could fit around a dying crocodile, whose sins wouldn't stick inside a bucket. Anyone more than the 7 must have fire pointed at their crying. The eagle from the well was everywhere. My grown God, when? Blood in my leaks, while boots of my black hair. In a burnt man's stomach, there was my whole life I did not enter. Hunger is believing anything had with a bucket of gun. Ink my feather, she with waist like a vocal cord. She, someone's baby in a crowd. This next poem is by the ghost Rudy, who is a member of the Communist Party of Indonesia. That is his portrait. And, ideology is such a complicated thing. I was an organizer for 16 years, so I have like a lot of thoughts about this. This poem is an erasure of Chairman Mao's Combat Liberalism, which is a text that, at least in some circles that, that I was a part of was still often being used to train young organizers, and it always made me so angry because fascism, authoritarianism, cruelty, brutality, disregard for human life can take all kinds of names. Like it can take on the name communism, it can take on the name the New Order, it can take on so many, you know, it's just kind of like, what is the face that you're going to slap on? The willingness to sort of erase people from the face of the earth. And so I think it was always really hard for me every time, because I come from this history where communists were the ones who were targeted, and that doesn't make it okay for us to then like not look at what regimes that are doing similar things but calling themselves communists are doing to their people and to other peoples in the world. And you know, Mao did kill like 45 million Chinese people. So this is an erasure of Mao's combat liberalism performed by this ghost and adapted for the New Order. We stand for active ideological weapon, but this weapon stands for itself. To let things slide for the sake of a fellow townsman, a schoolmate, a close friend, a loved one, an old colleague, or old subordinate, to touch lightly, to indulge in private faces, to let drift things if they do not affect one personally, knowing perfectly well what to avoid, to give pride of place to one's own type, to not seek revenge, to hear as if nothing, to be among the masses and to conduct propaganda indifferent to them for their forgetting, as if ordinary. To see someone harming and feel, but to allow him to continue. To muddle along, tolling the bell. To regard oneself as major, unequal, while being quite aware of oneself, a corrosive which eats away dissension, an extremely bad stem. To replace by goods in stock minds in conflict our midst. To overcome staunch life, subordinating always and everywhere to collective ties, any person, all honest tendencies. Which is to say that erasure could also be adapted for America. Okay, what is the next poem I'm gonna read? Well, it's kind of like deciding between this. I'm gonna read this poem. And this is gonna be my last poem for now, before Peter and I get to chatting. This poem is called The New Order, and it's by the ghost named Hui Shang. And this is her portrait. And this ghost is particularly special to me because her name is my Chinese name, which I know only phonetically because I've never seen it written down. My mother's first language was Mandarin, and as part of the purge, her Chinese language school was shut down because Chinese Indonesians were also targeted as part of the genocide. And there was an organization called Baperki, and Baperki was a Chinese Indonesian organization that were advocating for Chinese Indonesians to be given citizenship. My mother, for example, was born in Indonesia, in Yogyakarta, but she was classified a foreigner because her father was an immigrant from Fujian in China. And so under the New Order, like I was also born under the New Order and grew up for the first 10 years of my life under that regime. Chinese languages were banned, and from any kind of public experience, you couldn't teach it. You can, it couldn't be displayed anywhere. And also Chinese Indonesians were regulated into changing our name. So like my name is Cynthia Dewi Oka because my name cannot be Hui Shang in Indonesia. I don't know. And I think this is like the part that like breaks my head. I'm like, yeah, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it means. The New Order, everywhere, afterlife. With your noses vigilant to the ground, forgive an infection's harsh slander. I said I felt you, like teeth above, teeth below. Therefore, I resolved to master you, like my own memory. Yes, I rose like a flower from the scrotum of the devil. Yes, I moved like a flood against the igneous mother. She was strong as American radio. But you are the ministry of bones. Dig, and you will find, like those nights I stood, fist not knocking on my beloved's door, nobody on the other side.
Thank you, Cynthia. Hi, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. As you were reading too, I loved seeing in the comments, people were like pulling out certain lines or a couple of words together. It was really neat to see like what sort of hit like that in different ways. So it was worth scrolling through that too. And by the way, I want to start just real quickly with reading Aracelis' part of her forward and what she said, because I just love what she says. And as you were reading, it just hit me as so apt too. She said, I cannot say enough how critical this work is for its history, specificity, and devotion. At its center churn insurmountable, incomprehensible brutalities. These are the facts. But Oka and her fellow organizers, researchers, artists, carriers of this history are also facts. With imagination and the sharpest tools, she cuts opening after opening into the page. This book is a fire, a ceremony, an unburying. It is a tremendous honor to walk behind Cynthia and this truly essential work. So I'm curious, after, this is your fourth book. And so what compelled you to write A Tinderbox in 3 Acts now?
Yes, this is a great question. I think, like the dedication, like the first sort of thing that I said, opening the book, is there's a hole in my history. And I think they're like twofold. The reasons are twofold. Like the first one is the direct sort of experience of what the New Order did, to my family. So like the way that I experienced it, the way that I saw it play out. I grew up in like an environment of just like constant disproportionate fear. It was just like fear all the time. And so many things could not be said. So many things could not be spoken. So many things remain unexplained. And when I first found out about the genocide, and this is the interesting tension too, right? Because I heard people, family members, like the aunties and uncles, it was a constant thing to sort of hate on the communists. Right. So like when we were living in Indonesia, but like, that is not the frame that you had. Like when I lived there, that was not the frame that I had, was that, oh, like there was systemic murder, like on a mass scale performed to get rid of these people. Like we grew up being like the communists were the enemy. This is like how you curse someone as you call them a communist. And it wasn't until like I was living abroad after we migrated, and we very much migrated because we didn't feel safe in Indonesia as a Chinese Indonesian family, that it wasn't until I was abroad that I learned about the genocide. Like I received that framing, and that it wasn't actually only, and the thing that was important is like it is from, I take my lead from that, even that framing, from other Indonesian women, scholars and artists who have written on this topic and who have risked immense, who've taken immense risks to write about them. And I actually want to show you two of these resources. One is called The End of Silence. I'm sorry, it's going to be like.
Maybe Dan can put that up there for us too in the chat.
Yeah. This is The End of Silence. It's a collection of oral testimonies from survivors of 1965-66 and by Suchen Marching. And this is like another one that's really great because Indonesia is like so well known for its kind of like, you know, cultural production and the arts, etc. This is called The Dance That Makes You Vanish, Cultural Reconstruction in Post-Genocide Indonesia, by Rakmi Dia Larasati. And she talks about, you know, like the legacy of artists being in particular disappeared, and then their art forms co-opted by the New Order's government, and then used to market Indonesia as a safe paradise for Western consumption, so that everybody, you know, so there's like also in this way, there's like amnesia at home about what, there was enforced amnesia at home about like what had happened, but then that amnesia also got transported to the international community because like, look, everything is so pretty here. And I grew up in Bali, you know, where the massacre was actually like the worst in Bali. And nobody thinks about mass graves when they go to Bali. Like they think of the paradise. So I think there was like that, you know, like over the years, observing sort of the effects of terror, because we took it, we left the country, we took the terror with us. Like it followed us to Canada, you know, and then I moved here, and it shaped me also in such a way as a person. Like I'm still kind of figuring out how to like dismantle like a lot of its effects in my life. I think that was the impetus for wanting to understand really what is the like, how do I enter these events? How do I like understand actually like the way that it, you know, kind of carries forward, echoes forward? That's like on a personal level. And then like on a poetic level, as like a working poet, I think it's, you know, Peter, is like hard to have to like explain where I'm coming from like all the time, because there's just like not a lot of Indonesian poets like out in diaspora, you know? And a lot of my work is, I am a political person and I deal with history a lot in my work. That's just been a kind of constant. So I found myself like feeling like I always constantly had to give like history lessons, you know? And I was like, but maybe if like the book exists, and it's also particularly frustrating for me that there are so few accounts of what happened in Indonesia by Indonesian voices that are accessible here. So like, I don't want to sort of invisibilize the fact that I'm sure there are folks working in the homeland on that, you know, but that doesn't mean like it reaches us here. It doesn't mean I can necessarily access that. And the majority of like political analysis or like literature written on this, like are written by American or European scholars. So it also felt like important for me to be a Chinese Indonesian person living in the United States and breaking into American archives in order to illuminate this story. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and you use the word archive. So Sadia Hartman used the term the violence of the archive. Can you talk about how your work relates to that specifically? I guess, you know, having used that word archive.
Right. I mean, the archive, you know, is so married to power, right? It's like the this is the official record, and it's like it's always like it's like bureaucrats like write this stuff, and a lot of the language gets really sanitized. It was so interesting to like when I was reading a lot of these memos and reports from like American officials on the ground. They were calling, you know, murderers moderates.
Mhm.
Like they consider, like that was how, for example, like they would frame the people committing like mass murders. Like these are the moderates that we want to work with. So we should support them and give them more lists of names, or, you know, financial support or communications assistance. And that is like communications assistance. And here's the thing, there are like, also, there's actually like a poem in here in the book called Memorandum, prepared for the 303 committee, which is like the committee that sort of governs covert actions performed by, you know, the US government. And they're like pages, those pages are not declassified. And so we cannot know fully the extent to which American intervention, it's like, we know that they wanted to, we know that there was overt support in the giving of names, like that's for sure. We know that there was military money, like the US government had a lot of money invested, particularly for military assistance in Indonesia. Like that was where the bulk of the money was going. But in terms of like the specifics, you know, like what did special ops do? It's like, we don't know, but like, we won't know either, but like many other countries, it's that stuff is not going to get declassified. And so we have to kind of use our imagination. But this communications assistance piece really kind of gets at me, because propaganda was the tool that was used to kind of silence this. It wasn't just to silence what happened, to silence survivors, to gaslight an entire nation, essentially. Because it wasn't just about not talking about it. It's about offering a version that felt like that was really compelling, that gave people like, these are the enemies, and like, this is like why we have to get rid of them. And I think that is a way, you know, sort of like the debates about that, you know, kind of how people were, that's what you kind of get to see unfold in the archive, is sort of like the dehumanization of like an entire people, because this is how they were reporting. This is how American officials were like reporting to each other about it. It was like, it's not, humanity was not on the table at all. It was just about how do we make sure that the elements that we want to succeed. And here are like different frames for thinking about that. It's like, oh, great, like 15,000 people got killed today. Like, you know, so I think the violence of the archive to me has to do with, you know, like, how do you, it's about, you excise humanity out of language. Like you make language sort of not do, you make language not communicate.
Mhm.
If that makes
Mhm.
sense. Like you
Yeah.
actually interrupt communicate, you use language to interrupt, to make communication fail. And I think that's so, and to shut out like other possible versions of what could have happened. And so I think, so that is how I think about the violence of the archive. And for me now, as an Indonesian person with American citizenship, it also felt important to implicate myself in that, you know, to make myself complicit with that archive by working with it. but I am complicit in a hostile way, if that makes sense. It's like, I don't want to sort of pretend that I'm not complicit in the American project as someone like living here. But to the extent that I am complicit, I am also hostile. And that is like what, that's like a lot of the interventions that I perform like on those materials inside the book have to do with that. With like enacting that hostility. It's like, I'm gonna cut up the pages the way that, you know, you cut up the stories of my people, or like my people literally. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I see people writing in the notes, and it hit me too, the complicit in a hostile way. That's gonna stick for a while. That's a lot to chew on. That's amazing. I'm curious, you talked about dismantling, terror that you had grown up with, which is obviously a huge statement, a huge project. And I'm curious, how do you feel like you might have grown or changed as a result of working on a Tinderbox and 3X?
Right. I think I came to understand a lot more of where that terror comes from. I think, and of course, it's also older than that. We were colonized for 350 years. So this is just like one moment in a succession of terroristic events that have happened to peoples living in what is now known as Indonesia, because even that had to be created, like there are 300 languages, like 17,000 islands. Like violence was very much like a part of bringing people together, and to expel the colonizers, the occupiers, and then to kind of bind each other, to bind people to each other. And so I think I came to have a better understanding of what was at stake in terror. Like, why was it functional for my parents' generation? Because it was very difficult for me to receive growing up. Like, I have a lot of wounds from my childhood as a result of living in that way, and I think the understanding allows for a level of forgiveness for me for my parents that I probably wouldn't have been able to have, if I didn't do that. Like, I would have just been like, oh my God, they're just kind of like terrible people, or like whatever. And they're not, but it's just like, I would have probably, the way that we're wounded when our wounds are not acknowledged, it's like, it's hard to see complexity, right? So I think that in a really personal way, that's really changed my life, like writing this and understanding like this is like the context that they were baked in, and I experienced the aftermath of the New Order dictatorship, right? But I didn't live through 65, 66 when people were just like disappearing from the neighborhood. And what that would have done, just psychically to people, or like where people were forced to live with perpetrators who like killed their son or their brother-in-law or their grandpa or their dad, or etc. Right? Because those perpetrators were never held to account. They became landowners. They like ended up becoming like employers. Like, they were given positions of authority over the people that they had victimized. And so again, like that, like thinking about the reverberations of terror through that, I think that really changed me. And I think also, I gave myself a certain kind of freedom in working in the way that I worked with the archives, or even just like, the portraits that I created, because there were just so many moments, like experiencing the archive and trying to write through it to make sense of it, where I didn't have language. Like, language just failed me, like again and again. And so I think writing this book also allowed me to trust myself as a poet in a new way. Because I'm just, even when language fails, there's like other things that I can figure out how to do in order to communicate. Because that is sort of kind of like where I come from, is like the failure of language, actually.
And I think that's something I love about this book too, is that sort of feeling of collage with the images and erasures and documents. I mean, it's such a, you know, and it really, when you say that, like language, you know, failing and how do you find the next level, that all sort of clicked together for me with this book of all the different ways you approach it. Somebody asked a question, and so I want to give them a chance to ask that. So let me see where it is. Okay. This is Garden O saying, hi, Cynthia. As an early reader of the book, I'm curious to just hear you talk more about coherence and the book's resistance/divestment from narrative clarity. How does resistance to narrative clarity connect to diasporic estrangement/connection in your view?
I mean, thank you so much. That's a great question. I think one of the things that I've experienced, and I feel like, you know, I want to be clear that when I'm talking about like Western readers, I am implicating myself. I am a Western reader. I have lived longer in the West than I have lived in Asia. I think there's like a particular kind of like literacy training here, through media, through like things that we encounter, through like the framing, the political framings that is like America, that I think there's like a conflation of like reductiveness with clarity, with like something being reduced to its essence, that makes it clear, or that makes it coherent, or like coherence is like a, this happens and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens. And the problem with that, I feel like, is, you know, we cut out so many voices out of that process. When we insist on coherence, I feel like we also cut out voices. And we cut out voices of the most vulnerable. We cut out voices of the most impacted, because that's who's easy to cut out. Right? And this is why I'm like, I just believe that I cannot believe that coherence is the best thing that we can offer each other. I feel like compassion is a better thing to offer each other. I think curiosity is a better thing to offer each other. I think the willingness to sort of like not understand and stay with people is a better thing for us to offer each other. Like every migrant and refugee who comes here should not have to be like, look, I am a legible, like these are all the ways that I'm legible to you as a human being, therefore please treat me like as a human being. Like that is, or just like BIPOC, like in particular, like in general, like in the United States, it's just like this kind of insistence on, you know, we need to know all of the things that like fit inside of our frame so we can decide if you are good or bad, if you're going to be a villain or hero of the story. And I think that is also like a particular way of thinking about narrative in Western thought, which makes sense because, you know, like that is what narrative, that's how narrative was developed also through conquest, like in the context of the West, right? It's like there is a stake in narrative, like narrative had to do something which was to justify the taking of lands or like the elimination of peoples or like indenturement, enslavement, forced displacement of people, etc. And so narrative always had a stake. And I think sometimes we need to blow up the stakes and like start with, and sometimes, you know, like I feel like when these things happened, they have, you know, what happens when something explodes? There's like actually like a bajillion directions that the shrapnel goes. You know, I feel like clarity for me is learning to like slow down and like notice all of those pieces and not just like move to the next thing. and be like, okay, we're going to pick this one particular chunk and be like, oh, there's gold there. So like, let's do that. And like, let's then exploit it and see like what happens next. But like, I want to see, I think like looking at all of those pieces, I think that's clarity. If that makes sense. Did that answer the question? Hopefully. Kind of.
It's such a treat listening to you. I'm just like watching poems like spin out off your tongue as you speak. It's really amazing. It's like, I feel like there's a whole other extension of this book that just happened orally here. So I'm glad we're capturing it. It's really a treat. And I could talk to you for hours and hours, but we do have to wrap up here. So I would love if you would be willing to share one more poem with us before we go. And I also just want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank Writers and Books for hosting this. Thank you for coming and sharing your work with us. And I hope everybody will check out A Tinderbox in 3 Acts because it is phenomenal.
Thank you so much, Peter. And yes, ditto on all of the gratitudes. And thank you so much to everyone who came. I love y'all. Okay. So I'm actually not going to read a poem for this final thing. I'm going to read a footnote. So one of the elements, one of the structural elements of this book is, looks like this, like footnotes. And I had mentioned earlier, there are 7 speakers, right? In this book, there are 6 who are the fictional ghosts representing sort of like different relationships and positions inside of the events of 1965, 66. And then there is like Nani, who is my alter ego. And this is where Nani speaks, is through the footnotes. And the reason that I did that was because I felt it was important for her to show up. It felt important to show the hand of the poet. It's like, it's not just to make like a bunch of, like a really cool collage, but it's like, I think it was important to show the hand of the poet. Like, I am the person who made this because it is a made thing, and it is one of many made things. It is not, how should I say? This is not like the be all end all. Like there's so much that there's so many people who need to be able to like speak about what happened. And I am a very, I'm in a position privileged to be able to do that as someone with American citizenship. And so I wanted her to show up, but be decentered. But be present enough in the story to be accountable. Note. I remember feeling sorry for my father, who had completely misjudged the where. It was the 2nd or 3rd month of English when he packed for my lunch rice with fried slices of Spam. An American, therefore, prized meat back home. I was being bullied every day at school, not by white kids, but by Chinese kids eager to flex their newly minted Canadian belonging. That's not a place, they said when I told them where I was from. You don't speak Chinese, so you're not Chinese, they said when I told them what I was. You look like a hobo, they said, pulling at the adult-sized clothing my parents bought from garage sales and sewed up to fit my 10-year-old frame. My father tried to help me gain their respect with his culinary choices, but it had the opposite effect. I wouldn't feed my dog that, they said. Not all marked with communism were killed. Thousands more were imprisoned. On Buru Island, inmates built the barracks, latrines, bridges, and roads required for their own detainment, which for many lasted well over a decade. Tore alive with their fingers lizards, rats, anything that crawled to supplement the soil's poor yield. If they survived, Indonesians marked ex-political prisoner on their identification cards, as well as their relatives and children, were legislated out of various forms of education and employment in the decades that followed, like those marked foreigner. My mother, born in Yogyakarta to a Chinese father, was a foreigner. During the anti-communist purge, her Chinese language school was shut down permanently, while Res Publica University, founded by the Chinese Indonesian organization Baperki, was burned down. In place of the latter, the Indonesian government established Trisakti University, a private institution my father would later attend. What was everything to us there meant nothing to them here. Though the reason we were not of or in or for a place was because our lives meant nothing to anyone, anywhere. Later, my father would look at me and see them here more than us nowhere, with a glint of hatred, while I would see him everywhere. I ate alone in the bathroom stall. I roamed the back edges of the field with spitballs in my hair. Salju, I said, meaning snow. That was how I learned to live outside the time of nations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I want to thank Peter Connors. Let's say buy the book. The link is in the chat. Tinderbox in 3X. It comes out tomorrow. And I want to thank our funders, and I want to thank everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, writers and books. Have a good night, everybody. I love you too. I just saw somebody say that in the chat. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.